ChatGPT said Darius Cole, a black man, was quietly meditating on a park bench when a white police officer claimed he matched a description and arrested him for kidnapping. No warning, no explanation, just assumptions based on skin color. Now Darius stands in court not just to clear his name, but to prove the officer lied under oath. But how do you fight back when your only weapon is the truth? If you believe justice starts with accountability, like this video, share it and stay with us, because what happens next will leave you questioning everything. It was a thick summer morning in Mango Park, the kind where even the trees looked tired and the sun had barely cleared the rooftops. Birds chirped, lawn sprinklers hissed, and from a distance the park looked like any other suburban slice of quiet. But under the oak tree near the east bench there sat a man, motionless, silent, alone. Darius Cole, early 40s, black. He sat with his eyes closed, legs relaxed, palms resting upward on his knees. His white t-shirt was damp from the heat, his breathing slow and measured, like he wasn't part of the noise of the world around him. He wasn't sleeping. He wasn't praying. He wasn't harming anyone. Just still. Just there. From across the park, a teenage boy on a bike slowed down, curious. He watched the man, pulled out his phone and whispered, "Dudes sitting like a statue." He hit record. 30 seconds of nothing but stillness. He'd post it later with the caption, "This guy hasn't moved in 5 minutes." What's he doing? A few yards away, Evelyn Carter, 72, retired librarian, was finishing her morning walk. She took the same route every day for years. Same trees, same bench, same quiet. But that day, something stopped her. It was him. A black man she didn't recognize, sitting alone, not speaking, not moving. She slowed down, watched him for a moment too long, then looked around. Nobody else seemed to notice. She hesitated, pulled her phone out and dialed. 911. "What's your emergency?" "It's not an emergency, just..." There's a man, sitting alone on the bench. He doesn't look familiar. What's he doing? Nothing. That's just it. He's just sitting there, staring, not blinking. I don't know. It just doesn't feel right. Within minutes, a black and white unit rolled up beside the curb. Officer Rick Granger stepped out. White, stocky buzz cut with that swagger like he'd owned this street for 20 years. The second he spotted Darius, his posture changed, one hand on his belt, the other adjusting his vest. He didn't introduce himself, didn't ask if everything was okay. He called out, "You got a reason for being here." Darius didn't flinch, his eyes stayed closed. "I said, what are you doing?" Granger's voice rose. Darius slowly opened his eyes, turned his head. "I'm meditating." Granger let out a dry laugh. "Meditating?" He looked around dramatically. "In this neighborhood," Darius blinked once, "is that a problem? You live around here?" Granger asked, already stepping forward. "Because I've been patrolling Mango Park for 15 years and I don't remember seeing you before," Darius replied calmly. "I don't need to live here to sit under a tree." Granger's face shifted. "You think that tone's gonna help you, boy?" His words dropped hard and fast, quiet enough to not be heard by others, but sharp enough to cut. Darius's jaw tensed just for a second. "I'd prefer you not call me that." "Well, I'd prefer you answer my questions without the attitude." Granger stepped closer. "Got ID?" Darius remained seated. "I'm not doing anything illegal. I'm just here in a public space." That's not what the caller said. Lady felt uncomfortable. "You were just sitting there watching people. Ain't that a little suspicious?" "I had my eyes closed," Granger snapped. "Then how'd you know she was watching you?" Darius raised a hand slowly. "Look, I don't feel safe. Call your supervisor, please." That was it. Granger yanked him up without warning. "You people always act innocent until it's too late." Darius barely resisted, but the officer already had him turned and cuffed. Then came the nylon spit hood pulled over his head like he was a danger to everyone around him. The man who hadn't moved in half an hour was now being paraded like a threat. A jogger slowed. A groundskeeper turned off his hose. People saw, but no one said a word. Not yet. As Granger led Darius toward the cruiser, his voice rang out almost like an announcement. Can't just let anyone loiter in a white neighborhood and call it meditation. And that was all it took to change the air. No crime, no threat, no weapon. Just a black man sitting too still in the wrong place during the wrong season. And that was the beginning. The courtroom was colder than the hallway outside, though no one would have said the AC was working. It wasn't the temperature. It was the weight of silence, the kind that settles in before something unfair is about to be said, and everybody in the room knows it, but no one wants to be the first to name it. The bailiff pushed the double doors open and heads turned as Darius Cole was led inside. He still had the nylon spit hood pulled tight over his head, and his hands were cuffed in front of him like some violent criminal they couldn't risk having loose for even a moment. The sound of his shoes dragging against the floor echoed strangely in the space, cutting through the whispers and the shifting of people in their seats. He didn't stumble. He didn't resist. He just walked slow, steady, his posture still somehow intact, despite how they'd tried to strip it from him. A few people in the back rows frowned. A few others whispered. And one woman let out a soft, audible gasp when she realized he was hooded like an inmate from a high-security facility. Judge Helen Whitmore, seated high on the bench in her black robe, straightened in her chair. Her eyes narrowed just slightly as she looked down at the man before her. She was in her early 60s, white, stern, but controlled, and she didn't tolerate foolishness on or off the record. She tapped her gavel once, just enough to call the room into order, then pointed directly at the officer standing beside Darius. "Take that thing off his face," she said, her voice sharp but level. "This is a courtroom, not a warehouse." The bailiff hesitated. Judge Whitmore didn't. Now, the hood was pulled off. Darius blinked slowly, adjusting to the light. His expression didn't change. No shame, no fear, no confusion. Just a quiet calm, the same kind he'd carried on that bench beneath the summer sun. He exhaled slowly through his nose, shoulders lifting once, then settling. His gaze swept the room, not defiantly, not accusingly, just steady. The judge watched him for a long second, then spoke again. "Mr. Cole, you may remain standing for now." She glanced at the prosecutor. "State your charges." The man stood flipping a page from a yellow folder. "The defendant Darius Cole is being held on suspicion of aggravated robbery and kidnapping related to an incident that occurred 2 days ago in the vicinity of Mango Park." He looked up. He matches the description given by a witness at the scene. There it was. That phrase again. Matches the description. No detail. No date of birth. No video footage. Just skin tone and a vague silhouette. And suddenly, a man goes from sitting under a tree to standing before a judge like a threat to society. Judge Whitmore raised an eyebrow. "Is the witness present?" "No, Your Honor." The prosecutor replied quickly. "The officer who made the arrest can speak to the complaint and the suspect's behavior." "Very well. We'll hear from the officer shortly." Darius hadn't moved. He didn't even shift on his feet. His wrists still bound in front of him, his breath, even his eyes fixed forward. From the gallery, someone was writing fast. Not a lawyer, not a clerk. Lena Brooks, local reporter from the Bay District Journal. Late 30s, black, sharp-eyed, always listening harder than she looked. She'd been in this room dozens of times before, but something about this case had her spine tingling. She didn't know Darius had never seen him until this moment. But when that hood came off, and she saw his face, the way he carried himself, the way his silence took up space without asking permission, something didn't sit right. She jotted down a sentence that would later become her opening line. They walked him in like a threat, but he stood like a man who'd been here before. Judge Whitmore looked back down. "Mr. Cole, you'll have the opportunity to respond to these allegations. But for now, I want this court to remember we operate under law, not assumption, not fear." She paused, almost like she was deciding how much more she wanted to say. Then she nodded once to the clerk. "We proceed." And just like that, the wheels turned. But even before a single argument was made, even before a shred of testimony was heard, those watching closely would have felt it that something didn't add up. It wasn't just what was being said. It was how quietly the truth was sitting in front of them, still in handcuffs. You could feel it shift the moment Officer Rick Granger took the stand. He walked like a man used to being believed, like the uniform he wore was proof enough. Like truth didn't need to be proved when it came out of his mouth. He sat down, straightened his back, and placed his hands carefully on the table like someone rehearsing what innocence looks like. The prosecutor didn't waste time. "Officer Granger, please tell the court what took place following the arrest of Mr. Darius Cole." Granger leaned forward slightly, voice calm, clipped, confident. After taking the suspect into custody, I transported him to the precinct. He was placed in interview room 3. I read him his rights. He waived his right to legal counsel. Then, he confessed. The words dropped like a stone. There was a quiet murmur from the gallery. Nothing loud, just the kind of collective exhale people make when they hear something they didn't expect or maybe didn't quite believe. Judge Helen Whitmore narrowed her eyes. "You're telling this court that Mr. Cole voluntarily confessed to the crime?" "Yes, Your Honor. No pressure, no force. He admitted to being involved, said he was stressed, said he didn't mean for it to go that far." She paused. "Was any of this recorded?" Granger's jaw tightened. "No, ma'am. Unfortunately, the room's recording system was down. Technical issue." Convenient the judge said so flatly it was almost under her breath. She glanced toward Darius, who still stood silently near his attorney. He hadn't moved since the testimony began. Still cuffed. Still calm. But there was something different now in his expression. His eyes were locked on Granger like a man watching a storm roll in. Not panicked. Just ready. Judge Whitmore looked back to him. "Mr. Cole, you've heard the officer's testimony. Do you have a response?" Darius didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the man in the witness box. And then, quietly, "Did I confess? Or is silence just easier to fill with your version of me?" That line cut through the air like a razor. The courtroom stilled. Even Granger looked rattled just for a breath. Judge Whitmore leaned forward. "Let's be precise. Officer Granger, at what exact time did this confession occur?" "Around 9:15 a.m., shortly after we arrived. And you said the interview room wasn't recording?" "Yes, ma'am. The system had been flagged for maintenance the day before. No written statement from the defendant. He refused to sign anything. No witnesses present. It was just me and the suspect. No audio, no video, no signed document. Just your word." Granger nodded once. "Correct." Judge Whitmore closed her folder slowly. "And you expect this court to accept that a man who remained silent throughout his arrest, who asked for a supervisor instead of arguing, who hasn't uttered a single disrespectful word in this courtroom, just confessed conveniently in a room with no working surveillance and no legal counsel?" Granger didn't respond right away. She didn't let the silence settle. "Or are you relying on the fact that he's a black man sitting in a white neighborhood so people will believe whatever story fits the picture?" The room shifted. Not a sound but a chill that passed from row to row. Granger's voice rose defensively. He matched the description. He acted nervous, and when I questioned him, he didn't deny anything. That says something. Darius finally turned his head toward the judge, his voice firm now. "I didn't deny anything he said, because I wasn't even told what I was being accused of." Lena Brooks in the back row had stopped writing. She was just staring now, her notepad forgotten in her lap. She had covered a lot of courtrooms in her career, but she had never seen a man defend himself with that kind of precision, unshaken, articulate, and devastatingly calm. Judge Whitmore stared at Granger for a long second. Then she said, not asking, stating, "This is not a confession. This is a story you wrote to make the arrest make sense." Granger's lips tightened, but he didn't speak. And just like that, the air shifted again. People in the room who had walked in, thinking they knew how this would go, who the guilty man was, were now looking back and forth between Darius and the officer who arrested him. And they weren't so sure anymore. Because even when no one else was talking, the truth was getting louder. The tension hadn't left the room after the false confession fell apart. If anything, it thickened. The kind of silence that isn't peaceful, it's expectant electric waiting for something else to break. Judge Helen Whitmore leaned forward, tapping her pen once against her notepad. "Officer Granger," she said, her voice steady but unmistakably sharp. "Earlier, you stated the defendant matched a description. Who provided that description?" Granger nodded, slow and deliberate. "An eyewitness, Your Honor. A woman in the park that morning. Elderly. Said the man made her uncomfortable. She pointed him out to me before I approached. Her name, Evelyn Carter. Said she lived nearby." "Do you have a signed statement from Ms. Carter?" "No, ma'am. She didn't stay. Claimed she had a family emergency. Said she was leaving town immediately." The judge blinked once. "So you let your only civilian witness walk away without a formal interview? No signature, no phone number on record?" Granger shifted slightly in his seat. "She gave a phone number. I wrote it down. But the follow-up call didn't go through. Do you have any evidence she exists?" He hesitated. "She was there. I didn't make her up." Whitmore's voice cut sharper now. "But there's no footage. No recording. No second officer to confirm her presence. Just you and a name. Granger held his ground. She described him clearly. Black male, mid-40s, alone on the bench. Said he hadn't moved in an hour and it made her nervous. That was enough to approach. The judge paused, then leaned back in her chair. So you arrested a man on what amounts to a ghost. There was a shift in the courtroom, a subtle but visible one. People sat a little straighter. Some crossed their arms. A few turned toward Granger, their faces unreadable, but their silence spoke volumes. Darius remained still. He didn't speak, didn't shake his head, but the faint smile that appeared at the corner of his mouth wasn't one of amusement. It was the kind of smile a man wears when he sees a pattern he's seen too many times before. One that says, "Of course." No one noticed Lena Brooks at first. She had stopped taking notes. Her fingers tapped softly against her tablet as she pulled up Mango Park's local registry, a digital community of residents' safety alerts, lost dog notices, and neighborly disputes. She searched the name Evelyn Carter. 7 results. 3 were out of state. 1 was deceased. 2 were clearly under 50. 1 matched. Evelyn Carter, 72. Lives 4 blocks from Mango Park. Active on the neighborhood message board. Lena's pulse quickened. She clicked into the post history. There, from the morning of the incident, just 2 hours after the reported arrest, was a public comment under a thread titled "Police at the Park. Saw a man sitting still for a long time. He looked calm, not threatening. I panicked and called the cops. I wish I hadn't. He didn't do anything wrong, just didn't move. I feel terrible now." Lena's breath caught. She read it again, then looked up. Back at the stand, Judge Whitmore hadn't let go of the line of questioning. No visual identification on record, no call log, no audio from dispatch, confirming what she saw. Granger was clearly beginning to fumble. "We acted in good faith, Your Honor. The situation seemed potentially dangerous. Inaction could have meant risk." Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "No. What it meant was convenience. You saw a man sitting quietly who didn't look like the rest of the neighborhood. And when one fearful call came in, it gave you all the excuse you needed." Granger didn't respond. Not because he didn't want to, but because there was nothing left to say that would hold. Even the prosecutor sat uneasily, flipping through his notes like he might find an escape in the margins. From her seat in the gallery, Lena watched everything unfold. Her screen dimmed but still open to Evelyn Carter's words. Words that just minutes earlier would have been dismissed as hearsay. Now they were evidence human flawed and real. And suddenly it was clear. This wasn't just about an arrest. It wasn't about protocol or paperwork or oversight. It was about what happens when the assumption of guilt becomes more powerful than truth. Judge Whitmore looked around the room before speaking again, this time more slowly. "We don't convict men based on fear," she said. "Not in this courtroom, not in this state, not under my watch." A few jurors shifted, glancing at Darius again, not with suspicion, but something closer to apology. And that's when the story began to turn. Not with a confession, not with a camera, but with the quiet unraveling of a lie told too confidently under oath without thinking anyone would question it. And somewhere in that silence, the truth began to speak for itself. The judge's gavel tapped once, not in anger, but in precision, like a scalpel slicing through fog. "Officer Granger," Judge Whitmore began, eyes unwavering. "You claimed," Mr. Cole confessed. "I want to know where." Granger shifted in his seat again. His tone had lost its earlier steel. "It was in interrogation room 3 back at precinct." "And was that room equipped with recording equipment?" "It is, usually." Whitmore's voice didn't rise, but it stiffened. "Usually." "Was it functioning during this alleged confession?" Granger inhaled slowly, already bracing. "No, Your Honor." The camera was offline. There was a power outage in the East Wing that morning. The system failed. "Convenient," she murmured, scribbling something in her notes. He added, "And the backup server didn't capture anything. It said the file couldn't be recovered." Darius didn't move. Not a flinch. But something in the courtroom did. That invisible ripple of disbelief. Everyone had heard too many stories like this, stories where cameras magically fail when the story needs them most. And still Darius said nothing. In the third row, Lena Brooks didn't look surprised anymore. She looked locked in like a diver reaching the ocean floor and finding something no one else believed was there. Her fingers were already moving, opening the lawsuit file from 2 months earlier. A civil complaint filed quietly by Darius's legal counsel, long before this arrest ever made headlines. In the appendix was something she hadn't noticed before. A technical subpoena, filed by Darius's attorney, demanding access to all surveillance footage of his prior unlawful detainment from a different incident one Granger had also been involved in. Lena scrolled further. Attached in a zip file submitted to the county clerk was a folder titled Room 3 Export 001. She clicked. There it was. The timestamp read 7:13 a.m., the exact morning Darius was arrested in Mango Park. Lena's heart pounded. She didn't pause. She didn't question. She copied the file and sent it directly to the court's clerk desk, sliding her tablet forward as she stood up quietly. "Your Honor," she said, voice clear but calm. "I believe there is footage. From Room 3, retrieved from a prior subpoena connected to a separate civil complaint. It appears the same system was functioning, and the feed may still exist." The courtroom stilled. The clerk opened the file, confirmed its origin, and then looked to the judge. Whitmore sat back as if trying to decide whether this was divine irony or bureaucratic miracle. "Play it," she said. The bailiff dimmed the light slightly. The courtroom screen lit up, and then there it was, the grainy black and white feed of Interrogation Room 3. Darius sat at the center table, wrists loosely chained, posture still calm. His shirt was slightly damp from sweat, but his shoulders were relaxed. He looked like a man who wasn't surprised to be here. Across from him sat Officer Granger, pacing. There was no sound, just video. At first, Granger pointed, then leaned close, hovering, then pounded his fist once on the table. Darius never spoke. Not once. The video ran 8 full minutes. There was no exchange, no movement of his mouth, no indication of speech. He didn't nod. He didn't shake. He didn't even blink much. When the video ended, the screen froze on Granger's face, angry red looming. And Darius, calm, silent, watching. The lights came back on. No one in the room said a word. Judge Whitmore took off her glasses and placed them down beside her. "Officer Granger," she said, voice like a still lake, "you testified under oath that Mr. Cole confessed." He swallowed hard. He didn't deny it. His silence said enough. The judge cut in. "Silence is not consent. Silence is not confession. Silence is protected." He opened his mouth again, but she raised a hand. "Stop!" The prosecutor looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last 2 minutes. Lena sat down again, her hands folded neatly in her lap now. But Darius, he still hadn't spoken. He just sat there, staring ahead. Not smug, not victorious, just present. In the silence that followed, it became clear the truth had never needed to shout. It had simply needed a chance to be seen. And now everyone had. The screen dimmed to black, but the courtroom didn't move. No one reached for their phone. No one cleared their throat. It was as if time had paused just long enough for the weight of that silence on the screen to settle over every seat in the room. Darius Cole had not said a single word in that interrogation room. Not one. And yet here he was, accused of confessing, charged, shamed, shackled. Judge Whitmore sat straighter now. The measured calm in her voice had been replaced by something colder, more deliberate. She turned to Granger with eyes that no longer questioned, they calculated. "Officer," she began slowly, "you testified that Mr. Cole confessed willingly. Do you still stand by that statement after viewing the footage?" Granger hesitated, but not long enough to be cautious. "Yes, Your Honor." His body language was clear. He lowered his head. Didn't say a word in his defense. That told me everything I needed to know. The judge blinked. "You arrested a man because he lowered his head." Granger's jaw clenched. "I've been on the job for 17 years. I know guilt when I see it." A murmur rose in the gallery. Someone scoffed out loud. Another whispered, "So now, silence is guilt." The judge raised a hand to settle the room, but didn't hide her reaction. 17 years. "And still you think silence equals confession?" Granger's voice sharpened, trying to reclaim ground. He didn't deny it. "That speaks volumes." And then Darius moved. Not much, just enough. He slowly turned his head toward the judge. His voice, when it came, wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Every eye was already on him. "Funny," he said, "how silence becomes guilt. But only when the man is black." Gasps broke out, barely stifled. The words weren't spoken in anger. They were laid down like stone, flat, cold, undeniable. Darius didn't flinch. Funny how I said nothing, and somehow that let him say anything. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Even the stenographer slowed her typing as if unsure she should be recording this moment in real time or just listening. The judge said nothing, not yet. Darius's voice dropped, but his words sharpened. If I had raised my voice, they'd say I was aggressive. If I cried, I'd be manipulative. But I sat still. I breathed. I said nothing. And that, too, was a threat. Granger stepped forward, defensive now, voice rising. That's not what this is about. But the judge cut him off. No, it's exactly what this is about. She leaned forward, elbows on the bench. You wrote a report that claimed a confession. And when asked where, when, and how, your only answer was, he looked guilty. That's not evidence. That's not justice. That's bias. The courtroom was no longer just listening. It was turning. The audience had changed. The eyes once fixed on Darius were now staring hard at Granger and not with respect. In the back, Lena Brooks clicked her pen off. She didn't need notes anymore. This wasn't a court case. It was a collapse. Judge Whitmore's voice dropped lower, more dangerous. This man sat silently in an interrogation room. You projected a confession onto him because it was easier than admitting you had nothing. Then she turned to Darius. You didn't say anything that morning. You haven't said much now. But Mr. Cole, this court hears you. Darius held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once. Nothing theatrical. Just acknowledgement. Just presence. And the silence that followed was no longer about guilt. It was about the room finally hearing what it had been trained to ignore. And in that quiet, the story shifted. The courtroom door creaked softly, not enough to cause alarm, but enough to turn every head. An elderly black woman stood there, small in stature but upright, with a woven sun hat still perched delicately atop her silver curls. She looked like someone's grandmother, because she was. But today she was also something more. Excuse me, she said, voice thin but clear. I need to speak. Judge Whitmore hesitated. This wasn't procedure, not even close. But something in the woman's tone stopped her from objecting. Ma'am, she asked cautiously, state your name for the record. The woman stepped forward, back, straight hands steady. Evelyn Carter. I was the one who called the police that morning. The air shifted instantly. Darius didn't move, but his eyebrows lifted just slightly. Even Lena Brooks leaned forward in her chairpen, hovering over paper but not touching it. You're the witness Officer Granger referred to, the judge asked. I suppose I am. Mrs. Carter, said her voice, gaining weight, though I didn't know I'd been turned into one. She took a breath and the courtroom quieted, as if they could all feel something long buried being unearthed. That morning I was walking through Mango Park like I always do. It was hot, too hot for a woman my age, but I go anyway. I saw Mr. Cole sitting on the bench. He wasn't moving, wasn't talking, wasn't doing a thing. Judge Whitmore tilted her head. Did he seem threatening to you in any way? No, Mrs. Carter said simply. That was the problem. A pause. I'd never seen someone sit so still for so long. Not checking his phone, not watching anything, just quiet. In this world, quiet black men are the ones people worry about the most. And I'm ashamed to say I did too. She swallowed and looked directly at Darius, who held her gaze unreadable. I didn't say he did anything wrong, she continued. Just that he looked too still. Too calm. That's all I told the dispatcher. The prosecutor started to rise, but Judge Whitmore held up a hand. Let her finish. Mrs. Carter nodded and pulled a folded piece of paper from her bag. 2 days later, an officer, Officer Granger, showed up at my house. Said they needed my signature on a summary for court records. He told me, just a routine confirmation. Sign here, please. I did. I didn't read it. Whitmore leaned forward, her voice sharper now. You didn't read what you signed. I trusted him, she said simply. He said it was procedure, that the man had already confessed, that all I had to do was confirm what I'd seen, but I never said I saw a crime. I never did. There was silence for a moment, a long, aching one. Then the judge turned to the clerk. Is there a witness statement signed by Mrs. Carter in the official file? The clerk flipped through a file, then looked up puzzled. There is a form, but it's unsigned. The prosecutor paled. Judge Whitmore's voice dropped into something colder than fury disappointment. So let me understand this. Not only was this woman misled into signing a false statement, but her signature was never even processed into the record. Lena's phone was already out. She wasn't just taking notes, now she was streaming. Live. Her audience was growing by the second. She didn't narrate. She didn't need to. Mrs. Carter's voice was all the story the internet needed. And as the video fed into phones and laptops across the state, a hashtag bloomed like wildfire. They tried to erase me. In under 2 hours, it would hit 1 million views. Outside the courthouse, reporters were already assembling. Inside, Darius sat motionless but not empty. Mrs. Carter, meanwhile, turned toward him one last time. "I'm sorry, Mr. Cole. I thought I was doing the right thing. I didn't realize I was helping them lie." Darius looked at her. No anger, no scorn. Just a quiet recognition. Then softly, for the first time in hours, he nodded once. And that tiny gesture in that charged room said, "I forgive you." It also said something else. The truth once erased was writing itself back in. When the court resumed after a brief recess, the air was no longer tense. It was electric. Something had cracked open and everyone knew it. The truth wasn't trickling out anymore. It was flooding the room. Judge Helen Whitmore adjusted her robe and looked across the courtroom, not with frustration, but with quiet certainty. She didn't speak loudly, but her words traveled to every corner. "Let the record show," she began, "that silence is not an admission of guilt. Sometimes silence is the only resistance a person has left." The statement wasn't just for Darius. It was for the city, for every camera pointed at her, for the system she had once believed worked just fine until today. The prosecutor, a man who had once entered this room with a sure-footed arrogance, now stood slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he addressed the bench. "Your Honor," he said, clearing his throat in light of the inconsistencies in testimony. The missing documentation and the unexplained footage, the state respectfully moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Cole, effective immediately. Gasps echoed in the chamber. Some clapped quietly. Others simply breathed for the first time in hours. But Judge Whitmore didn't look relieved. She looked weary. Because this wasn't justice, it was damage control. Then, as if on cue, reporters outside the courthouse received a press release. Not an apology. Not a correction. Just a cold 4-sentence statement from the city's police department. "The department has reviewed the matter involving Mr. Darius Cole. Due process was followed according to protocol. At this time, no disciplinary action is deemed necessary. The department remains committed to transparency. No mention of the false confession. No word on the ghost witness. No name, just Mr. Cole." Lena Brooks didn't wait. She snapped a screenshot, posted it, and typed, "This is what accountability doesn't look like." Within 20 minutes, her post hit over 40,000 shares. Inside the courtroom, the energy shifted again. Darius stood for the first time since he'd entered this room in chains. He wasn't rushed. He didn't look around for approval. He rose like someone who'd never knelt. As Judge Whitmore closed the hearing and began to gather her papers, one of the younger reporters called out, tentative, "Mr. Cole, do you have any comment?" For a moment, it seemed he wouldn't respond. True to form, he simply looked ahead. But then he turned just slightly enough that his voice could be heard. "No system protects you better than knowing who you are." It wasn't anger. It wasn't pride. It was a simple truth, spoken like someone who had learned it the hard way. That was the first time he addressed the press. And it would not be the last. Because what happened in that courtroom didn't end with a gavel. It rippled. And the shield some thought would hold forever finally cracked. There was no loud reaction when the judge returned. No standing ovation. No raised voices. Just the kind of stillness that comes when people know something serious is about to be said, and no one dares breathe over it. Judge Whitmore looked down at the paper in front of her, then slowly raised her eyes toward the courtroom. "In the matter of Mr. Darius Cole," she began, "this court finds that he was detained without lawful cause, held under suspicion, unsupported by evidence, and subjected to violations of basic civil rights." A quiet sigh moved through the room. Relief, maybe. Or just the kind of silence that follows a truth finally spoken. She continued, "All charges are hereby dismissed. Further, this court orders the city of Whitewood to compensate Mr. Cole with the amount of $25,000. That payment will be deducted from the personal salary and pension of Officer Rick Granger." That last line landed heavier than anything else. Not because of the money, but because for once, someone was being held responsible by name, not hidden behind a department, not brushed off as an unfortunate mistake, but called out, personally. Officer Granger, sitting a few feet away, looked frozen. His face tightened, but he didn't speak. Maybe he was waiting for someone to protect him. But no one moved. Then, just as quietly, two internal affairs officers entered the courtroom. They walked up to Granger, calm, steady, familiar with the weight of what they were about to do. Officer Rick Granger. One of them said, "You're under arrest for perjury, falsifying evidence, and misconduct." They didn't yell. They didn't rush. They just turned him around and placed cuffs on his wrists, just as he had once done to Darius, without pause, without question. And in that moment, a quiet echo rang through the room. Darius had walked in wearing cuffs. Granger would walk out in them. The parallel wasn't lost on anyone, but Darius didn't move. He didn't glance over his shoulder. His eyes remained fixed forward, his hands resting gently on his lap. Even when Granger was escorted out, even as whispers grew louder behind him, Darius didn't react. It was only after the judge began to rise, closing her folder with a soft click, that someone asked the question lingering in everyone's mind. Mr. Cole, a young reporter, said gently, "How do you feel right now?" For the first time that day, Darius stood. No dramatics, just the quiet composure of someone who had nothing to prove. And then he spoke softly but clearly. "I didn't win today. The truth did." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. And somehow that simple line held more weight than any speech ever could. In that courtroom where so many had once looked at him with suspicion, now they looked with something closer to respect. Not for what he did, but for what he endured. When Darius stepped out of the courthouse, the summer sun was waiting. It hit him full in the face, sharp, unfiltered, and warm. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise a hand to block it. He just stood there, letting it wash over him like a man who hadn't felt real daylight in far too long. There were no reporters shouting, no crowd erupting into cheers, just a slow, respectful hush as people gave him space, not because they were told to, but because it felt right. The man who had said almost nothing had made them feel everything. Lena Brooks walked beside him, not as a journalist chasing a quote, but as someone who had watched a quiet man carry the weight of injustice without ever raising his voice. When he reached the courthouse steps, he paused, not for effect, just to breathe. A young volunteer from the nonprofit coalition, someone who hadn't been born when Darius first entered the justice system as a case file, not a name, stepped forward and handed him a sealed envelope. Inside was the paperwork for the $25,000 check. Darius glanced at it briefly, then handed it right back. "Use it," he said, "to defend the next man who doesn't speak fast enough to be believed." The volunteer froze for a second, unsure if it was real. But Darius had already turned away, his attention drawn to the small group of community advocates waiting by the sidewalk. They didn't come to thank him. They came to listen. Lena raised her voice gently, not pushing but offering. "Mr. Cole," she asked, "is there anything final you want to say?" He didn't answer right away. He looked around first. At the courthouse behind him, at the trees in the distance, at the people who were now holding phones, not out of curiosity but reverence. And then he turned to the camera. It was the first time he'd looked straight into one since this whole thing began. "They tried to steal my silence," he said, voice calm and sure. "But silence can speak for a lifetime." He didn't wait for applause. He didn't wait for another question. He simply nodded, then walked down the steps, not with pride, not with sorrow, just with the dignity of someone who had chosen who he wanted to be even when no one else saw it. As he faded into the crowd, the screen slowly darkened, and a single line appeared. "In a system that fears noise, sometimes silence is revolution. Sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's strength, wrapped in stillness." Darius never raised his voice, but he stood his ground, and in doing so reminded us that truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. This wasn't just a story about injustice. It was a story about how character, dignity, and presence can break through even the loudest lies. If this story spoke to you, if it made you pause and reflect, please like the video, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to our channel, Mr. Max Stories, where we bring you more powerful, thought-provoking stories that honor the human spirit. Every click, every comment, every subscription fuels our small team with the motivation to keep telling stories that matter, stories that don't just entertain, but leave something behind. Because here at Mr. Max Stories, we don't just tell what happened. We remind the world what should never be forgotten. Thank you for watching. Now let's step into the story.